When Britain voted to leave the European Union in June 2016, all those years ago, few people would have thought that 9 years later, EU citizens will still automatically have the right to vote in British elections. But that's exactly what's happening. Why? Well, because of changes to the Elections Act in 2022 of local voting rights for EU citizens, well, they will not take effect until immediately after the May 2024 election. So tonight, I'm asking you a simple question. Is this right? Should millions of EU citizens be able to vote in the upcoming May elections? Email me, farage@gbnews.com, or on X, tweet the hashtag FarageOnGBNews with your comment. Now, let's turn to polling expert, the legend that is the Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, Sir John Curtis. Sir John, welcome to Farage on GB News. Great to see you there.
Hi, Christopher.
Can you explain, just for the layman, why are EU citizens voting in UK elections so long after we left the European Union?
Well, it's a perfectly good question, though I'm going to disappoint you because I'm actually going to tell you that actually, for the most part, EU citizens are going to keep their rights to vote in elections, even beyond these 2024 local elections. What the government has decided to do is to allow anybody who was already resident in the UK up to the end of the transition period, that is to the end of 2020, to keep the voting rights they acquired as EU citizens. And I think that, at least it seems to be regarded as maintaining fairness to the EU citizens who already had that right to vote.
Yeah.
What will end after these local elections is the right of those EU citizens who have come to the UK since the end of the transition period, unless they come from Spain, Portugal, Luxembourg, or Poland, because in the case of those four countries, we have reached a reciprocal agreement whereby British citizens will continue to have the right to vote in local elections there. And in return for that, the United Kingdom is going to retain the right, even for new migrants from Spain, Portugal, etc., to vote here. So the number of people who are going to fall off the register, well, at the moment, it's reckoned there are about 2 million EU citizens on the register. That's about 5% of the electorate able to vote in local elections, not in the general election. It's reckoned only around 120, 130,000 of them will be taken off. As I understand it, probably the reason why it's not already taken effect is that what returning officers are going to be required to do under the law is to spend 3 months trying to work out which of the EU citizens that are on the register will still have the right to be on the register because they were here before the end of 2020. And I suspect, therefore, what the government decided was we better not do that just before the local elections, because that's going to cause all sorts of mayhem. Okay. Although, of course, it will be something the returning officers will have to cope with between now and next year's local elections, with, of course, a small matter of a general election to sort out along the way.
Goodness gracious. Let's a few quick questions then. It only affects local elections and mayoral elections, not the general election. Is that right?
Correct. And it also affects the PCC election. I should also say, however, it doesn't affect local elections in either Scotland or Wales or the devolved elections, because both in Scotland and in Wales, the devolved institutions have decided that anybody who is permanently resident in Scotland or in Wales, irrespective of their citizenship, will now have the right to vote. And that's already been implemented in both parts of the UK.
And that includes Holyrood elections to the Scottish Assembly and the Senate.
It means American citizens, Brazilian citizens. So it's long been the case that Commonwealth citizens could vote here, and that right will still remain. But if you live in Scotland or in Wales, whether you're EU or non-EU, anybody who is resident here that already has the right to vote in local elections.
Extraordinary. And do they have to be living here to vote, or can you move to Spain or wherever and then vote by post?
Well, that's right. We're now talking about British citizens. British citizens, the right of British citizens to vote while living abroad actually has been extended. There was a time limit. That time limit has now been got rid of. And to that extent, at least so far as general elections are concerned, not local elections, the rights of British citizens living abroad have now been extended.
And EU citizens who go home Can they maintain a right to vote in the UK, having left?
Once they're no longer resident here, they will lose their right to vote.
Is this at all... It's done to allow for an unwinding of the arrangement of being part of the European Union, but is it... Do you find it surprising or acceptable or kind of a very British way to get round a difficult situation?
Well, I mean, I think you have to ask yourself, Christopher, well, why is it that somebody who was born in southern Ontario and who comes to the UK to live can vote, while somebody who comes from northern Michigan cannot? The truth is that our rules on voting are a result of historical accretion. We have long, as I said earlier, allowed Commonwealth citizens to vote. We have long allowed Irish citizens to vote. Then when we joined the EU and the EU introduced local elections, voting for EU citizens, we added that too, though only for local elections. At some point, there is an argument for saying we ought to look at this sensibly and decide, well, is this only for British citizens? In which case we make it only for British citizens. Or, as Scotland and Wales have decided, well, actually, we allow anybody who is permanently resident here to vote. Those are at least two logical positions. What we've got at the moment is, frankly, a bit of a historical potpourri.
But it should sort itself out, is what you're hoping. It just seems extraordinary that we're 9 years after we leave the EU, we're still giving the rights to vote on elections in this country to EU citizens.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I entirely understand your point. But the truth is, history keeps a long legacy, and the right of EU citizens who are already here before we got out of the EU, that right has been retained and will be retained even after these local elections. We can argue about it, but
of course,
the historical legacy that we've decided to retain.
Just finally, Sir John, thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you for giving us the chapter and verse for our viewers and listeners, and they'll be responding to what you say. Are we over generous? Are other countries as generous as we are about the right to vote?
Well, as I've already suggested, I mean, Scotland and Wales are not unique in moving towards residently-based systems. Around a half or so of EU countries give non-citizens the right to vote, irrespective of whether they're from the EU or not. And those countries actually also, UK citizens living there will also be able to vote. So in other words, there is actually something of a move, certainly within Europe, towards a residency-based qualification rather than a citizenship-based one.
Well, listen, Sir John Curtis, Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University, thank you for joining us, explaining that to our listeners and viewers now.